organisation which has the mandate to hold both the government and the industry to account. I think that's a very interesting case. I don't know whether you can reflect on that, but just wanted to say it anyway. Curious your reflections on the two presentations.
Sure. Well, yesterday, something like 24 hours ago, I was stuck into the west end of the eastbound British Airways jumbo jet in remarkably intimate contact with a number of other passengers. And flown here over a 10-hour period, which felt a bit like I'd been extraordinarily renditioned by the CIA, and then required to explain 13 years of history of the Forest Practices Board in 10 minutes at approximately 4 a.m. It struck me a moment ago that waterboarding might have been preferable. It's always interesting to look at, and I follow Guillermo's discussion of how things happen in Costa Rica. And whenever you're trying to do a summary, of course it's in short form, and you just stick with sort of the official things that occurred and roughly the sequence they occurred. But behind that, there's the story of real people and real conflicts and a whole bunch of stuff which never makes it into print, which describes the reality of what actually happened. And so, in the 1990s in British Columbia, what was called at that time the War in the Woods was becoming quite urgent. And people were beginning to blockade logging roads to spike trees, to damage logging equipment, and try to marshal the forces of society to prevent logging, particularly in old-growth forests, which were becoming a major issue and still are. And that War in the Woods precipitated around a particular event, which was the blockade of logging by major forest companies in a place called Clayoquot Sound, which is an area of old-growth forest on the west coast of Vancouver Island, particularly marvelous 1,000, sometimes 12, 1,500-year-old trees, and a source of not just huge commercial value, but extreme emotional value for the people who were trying to protect it, some of which included First Nations, indigenous populations. So that precipitated a huge blockade, and that blockade brought in hundreds of people and led to the largest civil disobedience arrest in Canadian history, with well over 200 people put in jail over that and subsequent trials going on for some time. Again, it struck me this morning that you have a similar event in the collision of two nuclear submarines that is one of those inexplicable black swan events that's probably going to precipitate a whole bunch of regulations, which are now, I know they're busily working on, as we were saying here, in order to deal with a precipitating event. Clayoquot Sound was after British Columbia, and it gave rise to, in the government at the time, to the introduction of a forest practices code, which tried to lay out in intimate detail how forest companies should operate in the bush. And it also led to the creation of the Forest Practices Board, because nobody trusted industry and nobody trusted government. They wanted somebody they could trust to say, are people living up to this new law? And are they practicing appropriately on the ground? And you should be looking not only at what the industry is doing, but what the government is doing to enforce its own legislation. So they gave this new construct a mandate to act as an independent forest auditor to look at whether the forest companies of the province were living up to the precise details of the Forest Practices Code of Law. So that's traditionally the role of an independent monitor. Are they living up to the law? Well, that's all right, but then if we also were given the authority to audit government, to say, is government actually appropriately enforcing that law in practice on a daily basis? And then we were given also the opportunity to field public complaints. So there was, if somebody felt that something was going wrong out there, whether it was legal or not, they could complain to the board, and that would be independently investigated and reported. We were also given another one, which was to look at those cases where forest companies were appealing sanctions brought by government, such as fines for bad behavior. Bringing those to an appeal body, the board was allowed to intervene on behalf of the public interest to make sure that forest companies weren't somehow bending the law to their So out of that kind of precipitating context and the event which sort of triggered the government reaction to it, an independent forest monitor was created in BC. And it was given independence to the extent that it could report to the public without hindrance, without any editing by government or by industry or by anyone else. It was also capable of choosing who to audit, when to audit, where to audit, how to go about dealing with complaints, when and where to look at the effectiveness of government enforcement. It was also able to look at one of those crucial things in the verification arena, if you like, which is something may be legal and forest companies or government may be acting within the law, but does it actually make sense? And so the question that we also look at is, are the practices effective in maintaining the sustainability of forests or the security of biodiversity or the security of community water supplies or some other crucial function? And is the law itself, plus how everybody is responding to it, actually adequate to the task? So we're also mandated to make comment on the legal system. But we have to do that in a context where we have the independent right to audit, but we have no sanction power. We can't issue a stop order, we can't fine anybody, we can't actually ask anybody to do anything by mandate. And so we're constrained to act by the processes of influence. And so in the real world in which we exist, we have to try to influence industry and government on behalf of the public interest through processes of influence, not processes of command. That means that, well, the first criterion of that is that when you investigate something, you have to do it meticulously well, very well organized systems, very well documented systems of fair administrative due process. You have to report objectively and not be seen to having an agenda different from just analyzing the truth as it appears to us. And you have to do that in a way which doesn't insult the existing democratically elected government system, which I think is probably a criterion which would apply worldwide and with any country in which an independent forest monitor was actually operating, is that you have to do that in a way that is acceptable to the processes of governance that exist within the country, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. Is that you have to actually work with the people who own the forest and work with the forest, and to do that effectively well. That, as in our particular case, means trying to influence a democratically elected government and cabinet and the public service constituted very similar to the one in this country. And the way to do that is always a very delicate, tight wire act. At the point that you alienate a forest minister in the government, you no longer have an audience for the things that you would like to influence. If you surprise and embarrass the public servants in control of the forest operation, you cease to have an audience for those people you would like to influence. So, and if you are too unkind to the captains of industry in your reports, you only create serious enemies who have very powerful lobbying power and probably out-lobby you behind the scenes. So in other words, acting as an independent forest monitor is very much a matter of delicate balances and checks and balances and the activity of influence rather than the activity of command. So little vignettes like this. If we end up with we found some problem in the field, such as the inability of the current practices to conserve the environment of endangered species, and we're going to report on that. Inevitably, we would have extensive dialogues in advance with the university biologists, the government biologists, the industry biologists that were dealing with that matter by conducting a thorough peer review of the documentation that we're preparing, so that the scientific angle is properly done, and also that you understand what people have been doing rather than assume that they were just in default. And then, having come to some conclusions, we would be alerting people to their publication prior to doing it, not changing a single word on the basis of that, But we would, for instance, seek an audience with the politicians involved to say this is coming, here's roughly what it says, and we're giving you the courtesy of foreknowledge that this is going public. So that question of independence is not a question of being independent of sensitivity of the environment that you're in, but simply honest and unfettered in what you actually finally report. And that if that's done with sufficient integrity and sufficient evidence of a lack of a specific agenda, then it can get listened to and it can have influence. I think that's one of the characteristics that you'll find woven throughout the book, and also about this whole arena of independent forest monitoring of forest activity around the planet, is that in the end, you have to have effective and real influence on people who actually live there and manage it on a daily basis or suffer the consequences of not managing it. And this is, I think, a much more difficult thing to get our mind around than it appears, as it's become evident to us that we have global problems of climate change and destructive effects of that climate change on a huge variety of things, from the ability to grow food to the acidification of the ocean, or the loss of environments due to the meltback of Arctic ice, you name it, and a whole long list of consequences that are now global. And so the urgency of dealing with forest management and deforestation issues is suddenly taken on global proportions. If you like, it's almost in its severity and suddenness like the Blackwater event or the collision of nuclear submarines. It's an event, if you like, which is causing us to take on action. It's now, I think, appearing to be legitimate for development organizations, for NGOs, for governments in the developed world to want to command the developing world into compliance with proper forest management as we see it. I don't think that can be done without the sensitivities required to have influence rather than the authority to have command. And I think that will underpin all of these efforts that we're now attempting to put into place in support of global forest management, is that has to be predicated on working closely with indigenous peoples, with indigenous governance organizations, and with indigenous public services that are actually operating in the real environment inside the country. And it's the research, the prior research necessary to understand the actual cultural complex there that needs to be worked with and needs to be understood thoroughly before any of these external ideas of what's right and proper can actually be implemented.
Bruce, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, that was very good actually. It's probably about 11, but thank you very much for coming all that way to say those few extremely interesting and pertinent words. We're going to move now to